Yes, hi, good afternoon, everyone. This is Diana Arias with the Community Technical Assistance Center, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Family Engagement in Adolescents, Substance Use Disorder Services. Substance use disorder in adolescents can have serious effects not only for the young individual, but also for the family. It is therefore important for clinicians and providers to engage family members in the treatment process. This webinar will address the benefits and barriers to family engagement and present strategies to successfully engage families. With adequate attention to engagement, participation in treatment can be successful for all. Before we get started, I do want to take a moment to orient everyone to the WebEx system so you know how to participate in today's event. Please note that upon joining the webinar, you have been placed on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract others from listening to the presentation. If you come across any technical issues during today's event, please chat to the host who will be able to assist you. You will have the opportunity to submit questions for the Q&A portion of today's presentation by utilizing the chat box feature, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. If it's not visible, click the dialog bubble on the bottom of your screen and it should appear. In order to ensure that we're able to answer as many questions as time permits, we are requesting that you send in your questions at any point during the webinar, and we will address them during today's Q&A. We are very excited to have with us today Molly Bobick, a clinical social worker whose experience includes counseling in residential programs, treating adolescents and their families in community mental health centers, and providing individual, couple, family, and group therapy. Once again, thank you for joining us, and I will now pass it along to Molly to get us started.
Thank you, Diana. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here in conversation with you all. So before we begin, I'll just introduce us all to what we're going to be spending some time talking about today in this realm of family engagement and SUD treatment. We're going to begin with really thinking through what we experience as the barriers and the benefits to family engagement and SUD treatment for adolescents. There'll be an opportunity for you all to share via chat and a poll question, and then I'll also offer some of what the research demonstrates as the barriers and benefits and what works to engage caregivers in treatment of adolescents. And then we're going to move into thinking about how strategies from motivational interviewing can support family engagement in adolescent SUD treatment. And then we'll also then move into thinking about how some strategies from family therapy models can be an asset in engaging families in SUD treatment for their adolescents. And I'll move into talking some more detail after that about a case in particular where some of these strategies are borne out or were borne out for me in my work. And then, as Diana mentioned, we'll have the opportunity for some Q&A, which I'm very eager to be in conversation with you about. I'm really excited to hear folks' questions and be in dialogue. So we're going to begin, as I mentioned, with some thinking about what is the landscape when we're thinking about family engagement, adolescent SUD services. What do providers, what do treatment systems understand to be the barriers, and what does research tell us about the benefits of family engagement, adolescent SUD services? So here we have our first chat question here. What do you experience as the benefit of parent participation in treatment for adolescent substance use disorder treatment? We know that in working to engage parents in adolescent substance use treatment, that our frame, the frame that I'll offer, is one of unconditional positive regard for families, believing that they have an inherent worth and value as human beings, as parents, as caregivers, regardless of the life choices they've made or the challenges they're experiencing. Many parents have had difficulty themselves, and parents whose children use substances in particular face enormous daily challenges. So that's some of the frame that I bring in, that we collectively bring in when we're thinking about parent participation, but I am curious about what you all might have to say for your end about what you experience as the benefit.
Thank you so much for this chat question, Molly. So I do want to just remind attendees on the right-hand side in the chat box, certainly feel free to chime in just so that we can make this a little bit more interactive with Molly in terms of, what are your thoughts around the benefits of parent participation. So again, you can just type in your answer in the bottom right-hand side.
So someone offered, or a few people offered, thank you for those of you chiming in, that if parents are engaged in treatment, the clients are more likely to engage in treatment, which I totally agree. A psychoeducation point of view, helping parents to learn more about substance use to assist their child in treatment. Insight into the client's values and decision-making and their coping skills. So there's that other realm of if we're engaging parents effectively in treatment, we have the opportunity to assess in this more systemic way and learn more about how they arrived at some of their values or some of their decision-making strategies. I totally agree. People are mentioning increased support, positive support system. I totally agree. Someone else mentioned help address families' role in the addictive processes. Support, great. To allow parents to remain involved, I absolutely agree. Additional social support. I'm really appreciative of a lot of the contributions echoing this theme that by having parents engaged in treatment, adolescents have the opportunity to receive support. One of the things that I sometimes find in our work is that, especially for those of us drawn to work with adolescents, we may, in the context of being pulled towards the adolescent's particular plight, it can be really difficult to not judge the choices that parents have made and recognize, and it can be difficult to sometimes recognize that the choices that they've made are reflective of their own experiences, perhaps of negative beliefs about who they are as parents. And what we know is that drug users are stigmatized as are parents whose children use drugs. And I think that it may sound sappy or superficial, but we aim to really believe in the parents that we're working with until they can believe in themselves and their capacity as parents. And that might mean in our work to engage them and focusing less on doing and focusing more on being with caregivers. And all of these comments that are reflective of a positive support, that's the benefit of parents being involved, is so reflective of that unconditional positive regard for parents. So in wanting to hear more from you all and your experience, we have another question here for you all, a poll about, we have all these, everyone said, and again, I'm so appreciative of, such really amazing things about what we perceive to be the benefits, and we also know that it can be extremely challenging to engage parents in treatment. And so we're eager to hear from you all in your work, and in your work in supervision, or your work directly with clients, what you might identify as the biggest challenge in engaging parents in substance use disorder treatment for their adolescents. Some of the common things I hear, but we also have the option for other, is that, parents' schedules not permitting them to join in-person substance use disorder treatment sessions. I experience parents as not feeling interested in participating. I experience to have their own substance use disorder or mental health challenges that interfere with their participation. I don't believe that parents can be helpful in their child's substance use disorder treatment. My own beliefs about parents or my own experiences of parents or the narratives I have about parents make me feel like they may not be helpful, or I don't feel trained or supported in family-based services. These are some of the things that I hear in my work in training providers and family-based services, but I want to encourage you all to complete the poll on the right side of your screen as we can hear a little bit more from this group today about the barriers that they all experience. one of the things as people continue to fill out the poll, one of the things that we'll also offer that's really important on our end is to understand the power that impacts helping relationships. Sometimes, particularly when we feel overwhelmed or we're faced with the crises that many of the teens we're working with are experiencing, it may be hard for us to identify the power that we have, or we may have struggled to understand how our power can be an agent of change in families or a reinforcer of negative beliefs. Parents see professionals with their power as experts and oftentimes as gatekeepers to important information about their teens and what is happening for them and what they can expect. And we really want to understand how we can mitigate that power with friendliness, again, unconditional positive regard for parents, and experts who engage parents in thinking through what's best for them, that's sharing knowledge interactively, and learning from them. So that's part of the frame that we want to introduce as we're thinking about these engagement strategies. How can we be aware of the power that we have and use that power effectively? So it looks like the poll has ended, so we may have an opportunity to see the results. Oh, thank you. So thanks again for participating. That's really fascinating. It looks like from those that responded that the largest proportion answered C. I experience parents who have their own substance use disorder and mental health challenges that interfere with their participation in their child's substance use disorder treatment, with A, parent schedules not permitting them to join in-person substance use disorder treatment sessions, being the second follow-up there, with also some responses for I experience parents feeling not interested. One of the things that feels encouraging about this set of responses is people do not tend to endorse not feeling trained or supported, or do not tend to endorse feeling like parents can't be helpful. But we all know that these two answers are really meaningful and certainly represent big barriers to engaging parents in treatment. So thank you all again for sharing your ideas about that. And now we can move forward a little bit to thinking through what the research shows about these barriers. One of the things that's fascinating to me about this poll and being in conversation with you all today is that if we're looking at this, what the research shows here, it very much supports what you all endorse as your experience, is that when we think about barriers, we are thinking about barriers in two realms, sort of what we might identify as logistical barriers and then psychological or relational barriers. So these logistical barriers are the things related to time, scheduling conflicts, high cost, lack of transportation, lack of childcare. And then when we're thinking more about psychological or relational barriers, we're thinking more about how parents are really experiencing, caregivers are really experiencing the treatment system, the program approach, the providers, the program context itself. One of the things that I'll share is that when we're conceptualizing parent engagement, we're thinking about it as a more broader category than attendance. We're thinking about behavior, attitude, and alliance. And so those are the three realms that we want to think through. We're thinking about, is this caregiver engaged in this treatment process? And by that we mean to say, are they doing more, if they're coming, are they doing more than just coming in terms of taking the goals that we've established in the therapy room and trying to implement them in the life of their family and of their team? What is the therapeutic alliance we have there? And so when we're thinking through these barriers, we want to conceptualize them in this way. Are we talking about a logistical barrier here? Is this time, is this money that gets in the way of a parent coming, or is this a psychological relational barrier? There's something that gets in the way of this parent feeling like this program is for them and can meet their needs. And so when we're thinking through what works in the context of family engagement and substance disorder treatment, the research can tell us a lot. We can learn a lot from some important studies on family engagement. One of the things we know is that brief, intensive engagement efforts at the beginning of treatment is something that can really bear fruit. And these engagement efforts are really aiming to intervene on both the logistical, practical level, scheduled transportation, and the psychological, family members' reluctance, or what some might identify as resistance, some of their beliefs about the treatment process being for them. And so we really want to focus a lot of energy at the beginning of treatment. That's what research shows us can be really effective. Some things, just by way of examples, are things like appointment reminders, spending a whole session solving logistical barriers, and also addressing really head-on family members' expectations about treatment, their financial concerns, their beliefs about how treatment has been helpful for them in the past or how it's not been helpful in the past. And the few interventions that have found to produce a long-term impact on engagement are integrated motivational interviewing, a family systems approach and family systems techniques, and some strategies that are meant to address family stress and provide coping strategies for all members of the family, of the treatment, the system that's in treatment. And when we're thinking about adaptation of program delivery, we're thinking about, we know that we all have constraints in the systems that we work, but if we're taking a really collaborative and personalized approach, we want to be as expansive and creative as possible about how our programs can be adapted to include parents as much as possible. And in our experience, it really makes sense to try to weave these two strategies together. How can we adapt program delivery to make it more practically, concretely possible for caregivers to participate, and how can we also adapt our program to make it more resonant with a parent's experience and increase the level of trust and support they feel from us in our work with them. So that's a little bit about what works. So now now that we have that frame, that we know that family systems approach works, we know that motivational interviewing works, we know that adaptation and program delivery works, we're going to move in and try to talk a little bit about some concrete strategies. And the first framework that we're going to begin with is some strategies from motivational interviewing and that therapeutic tradition or that therapeutic modality for engaging family members in SUD services. So we're now on to another poll question. Eager to hear from the group here if you currently use motivational interviewing in your practice. We know that motivational interviewing has a really strong evidence base, and particularly if you work in a setting that's categorically a substance use disorder treatment setting, we know that MI has had a great influence in the trajectory and the history of that treatment modality. So we're here to hear from folks if it's something that you currently employ. So it looks like that poll has ended, so thank you for participating. And it looks like we can see the results here in a moment. So it looks like this is, it looks like that a good proportion of you say yes. A smaller proportion of you say no or not sure. No answer was the strongest response set. But it looks like from what you've shared that there's a strong cohort of you that do use motivational interviewing in your practice, which is excellent. And we'll talk more in a moment about how to use motivational interviewing strategies specifically for the goal of engaging caregivers, engaging parents in adolescent substance use disorder treatment for their young person. Thank you again for those who chimed in. So we're thinking about, as you all shared in your poll and as I mentioned in the context of substance use disorder treatment, MI does have a strong legacy. And so when we're thinking about how to use MI for engaging families in particular, we have a lot of reason to do so, which I'll talk about in a second. So one of the things we know, and I'll talk about in a little bit more depth when we move on to the strategies from family therapy for engaging families, is that there's a really strong evidence base to support family therapy for adolescent substance use disorder treatment. But in order for them to be engaged in family therapy, we need to figure out a way to get them in the door. And that's where I think these principles from MI can be really helpful. We also know that the research also shows us is that one of the biggest predictors of adolescent substance use period, and then also in terms of normative adolescent substance use moving forward or backward in terms of progressing into a substance use disorder, is parental monitoring. That the research shows that effective and clear and consistent parental monitoring is a huge benefit, a huge protective factor for adolescents who may be at risk of having a substance use disorder treatment. Having a substance use disorder and meeting the threshold for needing treatment. And we also know from what our colleagues in neuroscience can teach us is that there's a real basis when we look at the development of the adolescent brain. There's a real neurological basis for some external executive functioning. We know that adolescents, their go system is on and their brake system is less so. And so one way to conceptualize the importance of families is, what would it mean if we engaged parents to be more effectively the brake systems or the asking question systems, even because it's just not present yet in the adolescent brain? I know from what many of you shared as the barriers to engaging parents, it may feel like parents are not the most reliable systems based on their own challenges, but that's something that we can continue to talk about. We continue to think about how to shape parents' behavior to be the most effective caregivers they can be. And so when we think about what we need to motivate caregivers to do is we want them to be collaborating with us about how to address the barriers to substance use treatment. If we're engaged in a collaborative, non-judgmental, transparent process about the goals of the program, how we need them to participate, we may be more effective in helping them address some of the barriers on their end to participating. We also want to do what we can do to meet them where they're at, but also invite them as energetically and as collaboratively and honestly as possible to attend treatment. And then we also need to motivate them to make behavior change collectively, and perhaps in regards to their substance use behavior as well. The way we conceptualize teens in treatment is that they really probably shouldn't come to treatment alone. So this is a really important task, being creative and employing some of the principles we're going to talk about in a second to engage parents to come in the door and to stay in the room. Oops, apologies. So when we're thinking about how we can utilize these fundamental principles of motivational interviewing, we can talk through them now in a moment and think through some examples. One of the things I find is that it seems like, yeah, a lot of us are using MI, and it is something that has a strong tradition in the field, but what I always appreciate about going back to these fundamental principles is that sometimes in my experience there ends up being a little bit of distance or drifting away from these core themes about motivational interviewing. I think, for example, sometimes we may have an interest or a intention of really being non-judgmental and meeting the client where there is and accepting them as they are, putting them in the position to carry out change, but we often really do have our own agenda. We often do not tolerate resistance. We often really have a hard time with people's discrepancies between what they're doing now and what they hope to be doing. And I think in some degree we've moved away in our field a little bit from this real spirit that's empathic and non-judgmental and holding up a mirror and reflecting what we're seeing and supporting clients themselves. So I always find that it's a value to kind of go back to these fundamental principles. I think when we think about this principle of expressing empathy, acceptance, really being skillful in our reflections, we can express empathy for why, for example, parents might feel they have little impact on their teen's substance use. That's something I hear from parents all the time. They feel like this is their teen's behavior and there's nothing they can do about it. And that's something that's really important to reflect and be genuinely empathic towards. We want to hold the principle of developing discrepancies between the behavior and the goals of a teen and their parent. You know, for example, a parent might have a stated goal of having a greater influence on their teen, but then they may not end up enforcing consequences for behavior, just to name one example. And so how can we empathically, not judgmentally, but how can we reflect in a way that allows those discrepancies to emerge? Rolling with resistance. We can really normalize the ambivalence of a teen by, for example, identifying the positive of substance use. We can also do that for a parent that's using substances and normalize that ambivalence. And we can also, for also for a parent, we can really normalize that they feel anger and frustration towards their child, and also that they feel connected to them and wanting to support their healthy growth. Again, if we have a belief that all parents love their children, even when we're seeing this anger, this frustration, or our perception that they've abdicated in some way, how can we see that ambivalence is still there, and how can we roll with that as it emerges for us? When we think about supporting self-efficacy, we need to support the self-efficacy of both the teen and the parent. We want to acknowledge the appropriate and really undeniable growing autonomy of a youth, and also the inherent belief that parents can and should parent, and they are the ones that can best support their child. One of the things I'm continually struck by is that, again, as I mentioned, a lot of times those of us in the field do develop a lot of frustration towards parents, and then they reflect that it's difficult to engage them. I think parents can smell our judgment from a mile away, and so how can we continue to return to the spirit of empathy, the spirit of believing in their capacity to parent, and how can we allow that spirit to carry us through to create a setting in which parents feel welcome and feel trusted and feel supported. So in addition to thinking about motivational interviewing, we want to move also in thinking a little bit about strategies from different family therapy models for family engagement, adolescent substance use disorder services. So one of the things that we know is that in the review of clinical trials, family therapy has consistently outperformed alternative treatments in engaging clients in treatment. We can think through some of the specific models together. We can also talk about that if people have specific questions. But one of the things we know across different models is that family therapy demonstrates some superiority over usual community-based treatment in terms of both treatment retention, completion rates, and in symptom reduction. And so one of the things we know about evidence-based family therapy is that as early as sort of the second session, therapists have really good information about the therapy process and how it's going to go. And so one of the things we know is that the strength of the therapeutic alliance is also really valuable in predicting outcomes and also the family's risk to end therapy. And so we really invite therapists to be very attentive to the level of alliance that they experience in the first and second session with both the teen and the parent. And one of the frames, the real spirit of family therapy, also hearkening back to the origins of the field, in the 1960s, is really being multi-partial, implementing multi-component, comprehensive programs that simultaneously make room for multiple perspectives, address multiple individuals' challenges and their sphere of influence, and also we have an implicit belief that these family behaviors can be dynamic, can be malleable. We can have an influence on them, and that we can really adjust our interventions to influence this formation of alliance with multiple family members. And that's our goal. We have a frame that clinicians, this is not necessarily just individual therapy for the adolescents with parents there. It's really, our goal is to make it as systemic a therapy as possible. And that's what family therapy specifically invites us to do. So in thinking through some of these strategies in particular, we'll go through some of them now. So the first one, as I've sort of been discussing, is really encouraging a collaborative process, being really transparent about how we think this therapy works, how we think the substance use disorder treatment will be helpful to the family. And we want to build goals together, making sure to include their goals, including a relevant substance use goal on our end. So, for example, a teen may not be enthusiastic about committing to a goal of abstaining from substances at the beginning of treatment, but he or she might be willing to consider a reduction in use or reduction in risk of use as a goal. And, additionally, a parent, for example, may want to prioritize reduced conflict in the home as a goal, and we really need to be collaborative and take that stated goal extremely seriously. When we are building goals, if we don't have input from the teen and the parent, it becomes much harder to move forward in treatment, and it becomes much harder for us to ask teens and parents to do something differently, to create the kind of change that we want to support them in making. So one of the things that's really important in terms of this collaborative process, and then maybe this is stating the obvious, but again, I think certain things can get in the way for us, is what we call a spirit of non-judgmental curiosity. Families often have negative experiences of being judged. Many folks who are, their teens are in SUD treatment, they have had prior experiences in treatment in the past. They maybe have prior experiences with the juvenile justice or child welfare system that have left them feeling blamed, have left them feeling shame, and particularly for the specific behavior or substance disorder challenges. And we want to be curious about their past experiences, and we want to be curious about how it feels then in this moment to be talking to yet another professional about what they might identify as some failings in their parenting or in their family. And when we assess a parent's own life, we need to be compassionate and pragmatic. One of the things I know it came up in some of the perceived barriers or the perceived benefits is that one of the things that this spirit of non-judgmental curiosity offers us, in my mind, is moving away from certain rigid and fixed roles when we speak about parents and teens, particularly some fixed roles related to codependency and enabling. Some of these labels or these words, I'll say in our experience and in our practice, we really want to move away from sort of labels or categories that might feel too limiting and invite families and invite other clinicians to think from a frame of effectiveness and to think about how they may have unintentionally gotten in the way of things going better for their teen. They may have unintentionally, unwittingly contributed to a substance use disorder growing, but we move away from labeling them as codependent or moving away from them enabling because it becomes harder to make a change when you have a label attached to you that may be pejorative. Related to this theme, we really want to look for opportunities to be positive and encouraging, looking for opportunities to compliment and praise and agree with youth and caregivers. And as I mentioned, this alliance can make challenges later in the therapeutic process so much more manageable. We want to put the substance use in its proper place. We want to continually observe strengths in parents and in teens. You know, one of the things that can happen is that substance use and substance disorder can eclipse other things happening in a family, other strengths, and so we want to be as positive and encouraging as possible. And this is where it's really helpful to have a team. It's really helpful to have a supervisor, because when you're in a situation in which you can't identify a strength in a family or in a caregiver, that's when it's time to get some help and sort of do some more thinking about getting some more support and identifying that the strength is there, that something's getting in the way of us seeing it. One of the things that we identify as important is figuring out ways to produce an early success in the treatment, to kind of hook them to continue to come back. Identifying an adolescent-driven goal that you can address, something to make better for the youth immediately. One of the things that continually am surprised by myself is how once a client feels validated and feels heard and understood and feels like they can trust us and we're on their side, about what compromises may end up being available. That before that validation process, before that encouragement process, before that curious process was not available. Substance use related goals are going to be much easier to achieve once success in a working alliance is present. Teens generally want a good relationship with their parents and vice versa. And if we can work on this, you can see symptom reduction and build a relationship that's continually better prepared to address substance use and the real challenges of adolescence. One thing that we identify as really important is facilitating the discussion of current and past parental stress and burden for the caregiver. You know, we can be reflective of the pros and cons of this discussion being held in the presence of the teen or not. You know, when we're being curious about what's gotten in the way of this parent feeling effective, what's gotten in this way of this parent feeling confident, what's gotten in this way of this parent feeling connected to their teens. And again, we know that parenting a child at risk who is experiencing an SUD is in itself extremely stressful. And we want to be curious about the history of the current dynamic. How long has it felt that way? When did you first start feeling like parenting this child was something really, really challenging for you? And just like with the teen and just like with the system in general, we want to validate past parenting efforts. We want to find opportunities to highlight how well parents have done in difficult circumstances and what ways they parented their teen effectively. And again, as I mentioned before, when it comes time to observing strengths, we can't find value in the parents we serve that we're working with, and that's a good reminder to seek supervision. One of the things we can also be curious about is that we can ask how they felt about their parenting prior to the emergence of the substance use disorder, and also what we notice about their teen that we can sincerely attribute to their parenting. Sometimes when I have a teen and a parent who represents a certain kind of feistiness or a certain kind of assertiveness, that's a strength that I want to observe. So I see where he got this. I see where she got this strength, this powerful voice, this capacity to be bold. And that's because of you. That's because of the independent spirit, that fire that you nurtured in them. And that's just one way that we can highlight a strength in a parent. One of the things we want to do is establish a developmental perspective. Certain adolescent behaviors like pushing boundaries, taking risks, we want to be able to norm and put them in their proper context. And we also want to put what's happening in a life cycle context. You know, we understand behaviors happen in context. Substance use happens in context. And so how can we be curious about that and then put that forth for a parent? You know, a big task for us is sifting out what is normative adolescent experimentation and behavior and what is a substance use disorder. And we can be transparent with parents that that's a challenging question, that's a challenging exploration. We want to communicate to parents that this program is for them, whatever program we're offering. And we really need to believe that in order to communicate that effectively. And so that's where even thinking about some of this adaptation of program delivery comes in. What may need to happen so that we can just sincerely feel that this program has something to offer parents. We want to have our own clear understanding of how systemic change could help the parents we're working with. We want to really think clearly about how can we reframe this problem and these solutions relationally. We want to have our own clear relational hypothesis before we share that with parents, and we should share that with parents and teens. And that belief is certainly half the battle, and then we go about communicating it to them. And part of what systemic change means is moving away from the substance use disorder, eclipsing other challenges in the family and other areas for change and growth. Substance use is one of those problems that can tend to kind of not leave a lot of space for conversations about other things that need to change, or also strengths that exist within a teen and a family. And so how can we continue to put it in its proper place? And that can be the avenue for exploring how this program might be a benefit to parents too. Being curious about what else is possible, what else would they like to be possible in their family or in their relationship with their teen, and what else would be good to change. And lastly here for the family engagement strategies, we really, in addition to motivating them to think that the program is for them, we also want to motivate parents to help their youth and the work in therapy. A real strong belief that comes from these evidence-based family therapy models is a premise that they are the medicine. People get over difficult circumstances, people overcome challenges in the context of relationships. And sometimes that's a relationship with a therapist, and we have a belief that these relationships that this teen didn't choose, that this caregiver didn't choose, but to be in a family together has tremendous and profound power. And so how can we as workers try to marshal some of that power to make things change? We can share with them the brain-based rationale for this parental monitoring, that this is a biological fact that teens need parenting. And again, continue to praise and elevate them to increase their confidence that they can help their teen with SUD. I think sometimes what we perceive as a lack of interest in supporting their teen or a lack of capacity is often a lack of confidence. So I'm going to move to talk a little bit about a case in particular, and then we'll have time to go over some questions. But I'll just talk briefly about this case and then some of the strategies to engage this family, and hopefully making some of these strategies feel a little bit more tangible. So this is a pseudonym, certainly. So this is a young woman, 17 years old, currently a junior in high school, an excellent student. She lives with her mother and two younger brothers and her grandmother. Sarah's parents both have a history of substance misuse, and she sees her parents occasionally, but they're not currently identified as resources for her or her grandmother. She came to therapy after her grandmother filed a PINS petition after she began not coming home in the evenings and staying out all night or coming home in the early mornings. Sarah's grandmother believes that she's abusing alcohol and marijuana and that she has a boyfriend, an older boyfriend, that does not treat her well. Sarah acknowledges some of these risk-taking behaviors, but denies that they have an impact on her life. and shares that she wants to be more independent, doesn't feel like she needs to continue living with her grandmother, and wants to be able to take her GED so she can begin taking college courses in rather than finishing out high school. And so when we're thinking about some of the strategies that I used to engage this particular family, and they were not particularly eager to be in family therapy together, and even felt like the premise that they had been referred to was erroneous. A couple of things that I'll highlight from that process is I was really committed to being really transparent around the goals of the therapy. I really was wanting to be direct as possible about my ideas about how therapy could be helpful for Sarah and her goals of increased autonomy. She was saying that she wanted more independence and that it felt like therapy was a move away from that. And I was very honest, and I believed and still believe that the therapy could help provide that by her and her grandma coming to more of a synthesis about ways that she could be more independent, and her being able to be more clear about, on her end, about why more independence could be a rational idea. Not making any promises, but that there was a real possibility here that this could be helpful with her stated goal of more autonomy. And also with her grandmother, that despite her belief that her daughter should, or her granddaughter should be in treatment so that she can address why she takes these risks, so that she can think more critically about the choices that she's making, I have a really strong belief that therapy could be supportive in grandma worrying less by understanding more about why Sarah was taking risks, if Sarah had ideas about how she was mitigating risks, for her to be able to hear them, and for be able to focus on their relationship such that this worry wasn't leading her to move away and want to detach by feeling so ineffective and so not able to influence her granddaughter's choices. One of the things that was also really important in that work was validating each of their experiences and emotions. They had had a difficult history collectively and individually, and one of the tasks of the engagement was really understanding some of the difficult history, especially related to Sarah's parents, had led them to a place where they were disconnected from one another, even though a lot of suffering was shared. And so my task is about making room for each of them to share to their experiences and emotions, modeling, being able to validate. I think one of the things that often gets in the way is that there's so much rupture that in that context of repair, it feels like people don't have enough space to kind of take that risk, go on that limb and say, I hear you, this was horrible what we went through. And so one of the things we can do as therapists is model that behavior that we want family members to be able to exhibit for one another. And one of the things that also in terms of this goal of producing an early success was one small area of agreement that could build a compromise. You know, in this case, we ended up developing, I think in our second or third session, a plan that if Sarah would have committed to comply, she could have a later curfew than when she had. The premise was that she had a curfew of 10 that she never complied with and was coming home at 1. And so it obviously took some massaging to say, what if the curfew was 11:30? And of course, her grandmother at the beginning would say, why, if she hasn't been following the rules, why would I extend it? But this is what we can do in terms of trying to facilitate, if we can be the one that holds both perspectives, makes room for both perspectives, toss out ideas for compromise with more hope or interest or curiosity than a family that's been really discouraged for a long time can hold, then our hope or our optimism can take a family a little bit of ways that they maybe would not be able to go on their own, again, because of this difficult history and compromise. And then we also spent time exploring the grandmother's own emotional difficulties and her non-parenting life. As I mentioned when I was introducing this case, she really had a lot on her plate. And initially, she began the prospect of engaging in treatment with feeling like that there wasn't going to be much there to offer her. And I think in order for me to be able to communicate how there was going to be something there for her to offer, I needed to be able to let her know that there was space for her to share her own experiences, her own challenges outside of parenting Sarah, in addition to Sarah's siblings, her grief about her daughter, and that once feeling like once we were able to build more of a trusting relationship, and that I think she could sense that I was sincerely not judging her for how things had transpired in her family, she became more open to engaging in therapy in a particular way. This is not meant to paint like an overly rosy picture. Obviously, this this family continued to struggle with being engaged in treatment. Certain compromises failed. But the task is, what can we do to continue to have them coming? Because if we aren't successful with engagement as this continual process, any other goals related to behavior change, communication skills, more coping skills, we don't have the opportunity to do if we aren't thinking about being as creative as possible in getting them in the door and having them be in the room together. So before we move on to Q&A, something I just wanted to mention really briefly is that as part of the work here at Center on Addiction, we have a new NIDA-funded research project that is currently recruiting treatment settings who work with adolescents with substance use disorder, and it's a clinical training and feedback system research project that is designed to increase participation of family members in treatment and designed to increase use of family therapy techniques in treatment sessions. And it's an innovative project. It's exciting. It's something that we're working on. And if you would like more information, or if you're interested in seeing if the setting you work in would be a fit to get some of this training and have some participation, please feel free to email me, and our recruitment does close at the end of December of this year. So obviously this will be published and the slides will be available, but here are some resources and also some references here before we move into the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much for that, Molly. So yes, we are going to be moving on to answering questions. Again, I do want to remind you, you can certainly still submit your questions to the chat box. So our first question is, I totally agree with a collaborative process. However, how do you therapeutically deal with a family member that wants to cut their loved one out of their life until they change their addictive behavior?
That's a great question. Thank you for submitting that. You know, one of the things that does emerge a lot in our culture is this idea, our cultural beliefs about substance use, is this idea of sort of a rock bottom or even like intervention right on TV, where it's like this ending the relationship is going to be the thing that is going to prompt you to make a change in your addictive behavior. And I think there's two separate categories, because one is an adult in which parents may have more, parents, spouses, et cetera, adult children may have more latitude in making a decision to take distance from a relationship because the substance misuse is having too profound of an impact on them. But that's a separate category, right, than an adolescent. And I think one of the things that comes up for me for that question is even related to some of these strategies is that first, we aren't going to convince somebody or inform them that they don't have a choice. But I think we really want to be curious about where that belief or that wish or that desire comes from. I mean, my assumption is that if someone is saying, like, I can't take this anymore, I'm going to cut them out of my life until they make a change, that is coming from a lot of suffering. And that's coming from a place of really feeling ineffective and really feeling like there's not much that they could be able to do differently, that they haven't tried to have a different outcome. And so I think I first want to validate the suffering that comes from. And then I also want to kind of zoom way out and say, what way might you be able to remain in relationship and remain a caring presence, even if you do need to have some boundaries and limits? For example, if it's your teen, again, a teen is a different category than an adult. It's difficult for, and obviously there's certain, caregiving requirements, and that's a whole sort of a separate conversation. But one thing I would say is that if you're so frustrated by your teen's substance use, you could make a commitment to have a boundary in which you don't talk to them when they're high, for example. Is that a way that you can have a limit that isn't this extent of kind of cutting them out? And the last thing I'll say is that I think in my experience, people need relationships to overcome difficult things. And even though that's so challenging, having a cutoff is not, in my experience, is not really typically supportive of someone overcoming addiction or a substance use disorder. So I don't want to invalidate the impulse or the desire, but I do want to say it may not it's unlikely to be effective in changing the behavior of the addicted person or the person struggling with substance use. So that's a really great question. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We did have one of our attendees also mention that Al-Anon can be certainly helpful in supporting family members. All right, Molly, so one of our other questions is, what resources or activities would you recommend for helping families make positive change collectively?
So that's a great question. I think that we have some ideas about what positive change could look like when we're dealing with family, right? We want to think about appropriate boundaries and limits. We want to think about effective positive communication. I think we want to think about, again, developmentally normed behavior, flexible roles within family, but also clear roles within family. But this is an opportunity, we think about positive change, this is an opportunity where we can really engage in a really collaborative way. And so I think one of the things that comes up for that is that in addition to the substance use disorder changing, if this process were to be helpful for your family, what would that look like? What is one small change? We really also want to conceptualize positive change as being any movement on that continuum of risk. Any positive change goal is one that we want to really seize on. So a family might say, sort of like the fighting is really bad. So then we think about, all right, so let's teach this family some more effective emotion regulation skills. Let's teach this family some more effective communication skills. So when there's anger, frustration, there's decreased conflict. And, I think one of the things that's really important that's also related to that question, in addition to being collaborative with them about a positive change, is again, moving away from labeling. There's like one person with a problem and then or this person has a problem, like kind of a hot potato of blame or pathology or the kind of quote-unquote identification. And if we continue to use language about, so it really feels like in this family, blah, 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 or it really feels like in your home, it really feels like everyone is struggling, or it really feels like everyone has been able to make this change, we continue to reinforce the belief of systemic strength and systemic change. So in our language, we can really demonstrate that collectivist approach rather than that intrapsychic individual approach.
Great, thank you, Molly. Let's see, our next question, how do you engage parents that do not see their child's substance use as a concern?
Yeah, that's another really great question and not an uncommon one. I think, we're in a time in which there is, in the context of marijuana legalization in particular, in the context of, again, many people have had their own normative experimentation processes. So I think one of the things, again, if we're going to employ the sort of collaborative spirit of MI, we do want to move away from trying to convince them that it's a problem. We might say that we may have some psychoeducation to offer if they're curious about whether or not marijuana, for example, is harmful, that we have that knowledge if they're curious about that. But I think we want to validate whatever is leading them to feel like this is not a problem. And then we want to, again, zoom out, cast a wide net and explore what might they be concerned about. So if the substance use feels normative to them or it feels like it's not a big deal, we're not going to get in a tug of war about whether or not that it is in fact a problem. But we're going to be curious and pivot about, okay, so maybe this is not something that you're worried about your teen. Is there anything on the horizon for them that makes you concerned about? What are you hopeful about for them this school year? Is there anything that you would like to be different in their relationship with you, with other people? So we want to try to not understand them as not concerned, but we want to understand them as perhaps this particular issue isn't that motivating enough in that moment for them to participate in therapy.
Thank you. And let's see, do you have any resources to help build a curriculum for a supportive and educational family group?
That's a great question. I think that one of the things, well, I'm wondering if it's sort of about it's like a multi-family group. I think that I can add some, I don't know, Diana, what's the best. So there are some people, someone named Peter Steinglass is someone that has pioneered multifamily groups in the realm of substance use. I know that 7 Challenges is a model that many programs use. That's a proprietary manualized treatment that has some, many group components. And perhaps, I don't know when we can, so the first one was Peter Steinglass. If we send out things, we can add them. We can add some of those to the resources. The other thing that's important to keep in mind, I know someone mentioned Al-Anon. There's also the CRAFT model, community reinforcement and family training. That's not categorically for groups necessarily, but it has a really strong evidence base in self-care for concerned significant others, including parents, and for individuals engaging in treatment. So sometimes CRAFT is understood to be an Al-Anon alternative because of its evidence base, and so we can maybe add some things to the resources or have it be posted somewhere else. I'm definitely happy to add those and think through some more as well.
Okay, great. So I think maybe what I would suggest, Molly, and to our audience members, the slides and recordings will be up by end of week. But Molly, maybe we can just add a few of the resources that you mentioned, like the Peter Steinglass, maybe just do that onto the actual resources slide so that when we do post the slides by the end of week, it'll be a little bit more updated. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay. And we can highlight this is that these are resources for building curriculum. And of course, if folks are interested in the study in terms of family-based services, that's another resource as well.
Great, thank you so much, Molly. So we do also have your email. I am trying to keep track of time, and in the interest of time, we are going to have to wrap it up, but if there are any additional questions, certainly please feel free to email Molly. Again, I do want to thank Molly and everyone for attending. As I mentioned, the slides and audios will be up by the end of week. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate any feedback on your end. I would also like to invite you to our upcoming events. If you have any questions, please visit our website or contact us at ctac.info@nyu.edu. And on behalf of CTAC and our presenter, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.